Okay.
Don't step in the hole. Don't step in the hole.
Yeah. First, thank all of you for coming. This is a memorial to Mara, and she would have approved of the weather. In fact, maybe she was in charge of it. I got the idea came about after her celebration of life out at Walnut Creek Preserve, and Babs Strickland, Babs is here, and Pam both came up with the idea of American Chestnut because Mara wanted a living memorial somewhere, an outdoors thing. And I've never heard of the American Chestnut other than heard about it. So that took a few months of looking up things, and it rang true. Everything I read just worked. And then Tom and the American Chestnut Foundation out of Asheville have just been incredible and helpful and wonderful in agreeing to it. And the Harmon Field board and PAC for the Norman Wilder were just enthusiastic and supportive. And so it's happening. And hopefully in some years, these trial chestnuts will make it. If they don't, they're going to be part of the experiment, which is well and good to try to reintroduce. So I'm going to turn it over now to Tom. Oh, the ashes. My little blue bag of ashes. Thank you. She grabbed the bag. But these are Mara's ashes, and they will be sprinkled in the holes, and some of the ashes, which is what she wanted. This is part of her ideas. I'm just carrying them out. And each of the family will take up one, and they will put them in, and then Tom will mix. And then there will be 4 more planted in the Norman Wilder forest. We didn't announce that too much as a public event, simply because there's no parking there. There's very little parking, and it's on a very steep slope. But so we're going to go do that after this. But eventually there will be signs here and things like that. So it'll be a place you can bring people. So, Tom, you want to hook up?
Sure. All right. Let's see if I can do this. Thanks everybody for coming today. It's a beautiful day. My name is Tom Sayeli. I'm the Southern Regional Science Coordinator for the American Chestnut Foundation. I'm going to, if I can get this microphone on. I'm going to tell you guys a little something about the American chestnut and what happened to the American chestnut, and then talk a little bit about the work that we're doing at the American Chestnut Foundation to restore the American chestnut. And while I'm talking, I'm going to actually plant this seedling because I like the symbolism of planting a tree while I talk. But I'm just going to tell you guys right now, I kind of prefer, yeah, what?
You want me to do it now?
Yes.
Okay.
When I give a talk, I don't really like to lecture. I believe in group process. So I want us to engage. I'll talk about the American chestnut, but feel free to ask questions or chime in with stories or anything that you have. You know, it'll be a more interesting talk if we talk about this together and we learn from this process together. So I'll start planting this tree, and I'll tell you, up until 100 years ago, the American chestnut was one of the most prominent foundation species in eastern hardwood forests. This tree represented about 25% of the canopy trees. You know, so there was a lot of American chestnuts, and you know, this is mostly throughout the Appalachians, but the chestnut range was from Maine to Georgia. So it, you know, covered all of the eastern hardwoods, and it was a dominant tree throughout the eastern hardwoods. And it was dominant because it's fast growing and it's big. This is a tree that could reach heights of 80 feet and diameters of 5 feet across. So it was a pretty big tree. Albeit those are old growth forests, and a lot of trees around us could get that big, but American chestnut was certainly among the biggest trees. It was an important tree for people too, because it was a great hardwood. It produced long grain, straight grain, rot resistant wood, which made it very useful as a construction timber. It was also really easy to work with. It's about as easy to work with as a pine, but as rot resistant as the most rot resistant hardwoods. And you can get a branch-free tree going 50 feet tall. So you can imagine a tree that big with timber that good, how important that was for people. And you can imagine a tree that big that represented 25% of the canopy as being pretty important for the ecology. right? I mean, you don't dominate an ecosystem quite like that without having a big impact. So American chestnut was important from an ecological standpoint and from the standpoint of being a timber tree. What I think was the most important and interesting thing about American chestnut, though, is that it produced large masses of nutritious nuts annually, right? Everybody knows about the chestnut nuts. It didn't produce nuts cyclically like oaks. It produced large mass every year, and it produced a lot of big nutritious nuts. So this was a nutritional mainstay for humans and livestock and of course wildlife. And you can imagine how a tree that dominated the forest, that produced these large massive annual nuts, must have influenced wildlife, or how the loss of this tree must have influenced wildlife. It wasn't a good thing. So we think that this tree was pretty important ecologically. We think that this tree was pretty important for wildlife. And we think that this tree was pretty important because it was iconic. It was a big tree and everybody loved it. People loved to go out chestnutting in the fall and harvesting the nuts and bringing them back and then singing songs about them roasting over an open fire. By the way, while I'm doing this, I'm not spacing out and accidentally tearing the roots apart while I talk. A lot of times people are like, but what are you doing to those roots? I'm deliberately removing all this soilless mix because I want to expose these roots. And I want them to be in touch with this soil, this beautiful soil that we have here. I'm going to take all this soilless mix off, and when I plant this tree, I'm going to spread those roots out in it. So I'm intentionally trying to knock off as much of this soilless mix as I can. Anyway, this tree that had all the prominence of a large tree with a big broad crown has since been reduced to scattered stump sprouts growing at the bases of long dead trees. The result of the accidental introduction of a fungal pathogen, chestnut blight, or Cryphonectra parasitica is the scientific name. This blight fungus was accidentally introduced on Japanese ornamentals. Right? So we import a lot of Japanese and Chinese ornamental trees, and they're nice trees if you're growing them in a big open estate. You know, they produce big nuts that are edible, so they're pretty good for that. But we accidentally brought in a fungal pathogen on those Japanese trees. And it was first identified in New York in 1904, and by the early 1950s, 4 billion chestnut trees were wiped out. It didn't take long. It was a fast-spreading, virulent pathogen, and it did a real number on this tree. A tree that I would argue is very important to us and wildlife is gone as an overstory tree. But luckily, it exists as stump sprouts. You can't do much with stump sprouts unless you have a genetic breeding program, which is what we're doing. And thank goodness for all those stump sprouts, we're able to capture the genetics of thousands of wild American chestnuts. And sure, they exist only as stump sprouts. And most of those 4 billion trees are gone. But there's about 4 million left. And if you go hiking up in the mountains around here, and you can identify an American chestnut, you'll find them. And when you find them, sometimes you'll find hundreds of them. These tiny stump sprouts all over the forest. It's quite a beautiful thing. And that's what we look for. We look for those trees, and we incorporate them into our breeding program because we need a lot of American diversity and local adaptation. Because what's going on here is about 50 years ago, some Forest Service people who were trying to bring American chestnut back started looking at breeding, and they hybridized some Americans and Chinese, right? Because Chinese have resistance to the blight. And so, hoping to get some of that blight resistance from the Chinese into the Americans. Throw some of this in there to pack that hole in a little bit while I'm talking. The program initially wasn't as successful. They didn't quite understand the genetics as well as we do today, and the programs were abandoned. But starting in the 1980s, a man by the name of Charles Burnham figured out the genetics of blight resistance, and he understood how you can make some crosses. You could use these American Chinese hybrids that they had been working on and he used those trees, and he figured out that if you take that tree and you back cross it to an American and test the progeny for blight resistance. Then you back cross it to an American again, and you keep doing that for several successive generations. You can breed out all those Chinese traits and end up with a tree that is morphologically indistinguishable from an American chestnut tree. Now, that tree still doesn't have perfect blight resistance, because blight resistance is an intermediate, or it's an intermediate trait, right? So then what he would do, or that's what we would do, is we would take those back-cross trees that are almost entirely American chestnut but still have some of those genes for blight resistance, and we intercross them, right? So we have these hybrid back-cross trees, and we start intercrossing those. And about 1 out of every 100 is going to have really good blight resistance. You'll get genes from both parents for blight resistance, and you sort of double up on that blight resistance. Now you've got a tree that for all intents and purposes is American chestnut, but has all the blight resistance that comes with Chinese chestnut. And once you do that, you can start putting these trees back in the forest. Now, we're at that point. In the last couple of years, we've gotten all of our back crosses and we've gotten intercrosses, and so we have these trees right here that represents 30 years of work. These trees have been bred to be essentially a pure American chestnut, but it has all the genes for blight resistance. Now, does that mean that we guarantee this tree will be as blight resistant as a Chinese chestnut? No, because we're early on in the program. After 30 years, we're still very early on in this program, because now we have to figure out which of all those trees that have been back-crossed and intercrossed and gone through all this breeding work, which ones have the best blight resistance and which ones don't. Because blight resistance, like anything, is variable. As variable as our ability to resist the common cold, right? I like to use as an example, in my house, when my wife gets a cold, she recovers in about 3 hours, and when I get the cold, I'm sick for about 3 months. If I was part of a genetic breeding program, I'd be culled out of the program.
How do you do it? I mean, do you do it with the seeds? No, they wouldn't make seeds if they're too little. What's the process for?
Yeah, good question. So this is Doug Gillis. Doug Gillis is the president of the Carolina chapter, and they have one of the most advanced. They have some of the most advanced breeding work going on in our breeding program in the Carolinas. Very successful work. And he could probably tell you a lot about the work that they're doing, and that'll explain for you how we do this program. Doug, you want to continue working? I will continue planting this tree if you tell them about how we make the back cross program work.
Okay, the American Chestnut Foundation started with these early trees that had been crossed Chinese and American by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and picked up on that and started a breeding program up at Pacolet, Virginia, to go through 6 generations of breeding, roughly 5 per year. So what we did with the first back cross to American was to find American chestnuts out in the forest that were blooming, and we could get pollen off those trees and or take pollen to those trees. Strip off the catkins, take a paper bag like this bag and put around the female flower, come back, take pollen and apply it to the female flower, put the bag back on, and then get out there in the fall before the squirrels show up and get the nuts off the tree. Then we husk them, separate them, keep records of who the parent trees were and the American cross was, and then refrigerate these nuts. And in the refrigerator, that's winterizing the nuts. In the spring, maybe late February, early March, the little white radical root will start growing out of the nut. And then we take those nuts and plant them out in the field and repeat the process all over again. But we got the first back cross, the second back cross, the third back cross, the 2 intercrosses. And each one of those generations are tested for blight resistance by inoculating the trees when they're about 5 years old and seeing how the trees respond to different blight funguses. And like Tom said, we may pick very few trees out of 100 and keep them for the next generation. So we're looking for the very most blight-resistant trees, but we're also looking for trees with the best American characteristics. The Chinese blooms out early. American blooms out very late. So if we have a good hybrid with, but then it blooms out early, or if it shows other characteristics that are more Chinese, we may not keep that. We're looking for each generation the trees that are most like the American and have the blight resistance. So after 30 years of doing that, we do have these trees, our restoration chestnuts 1.0, and we're working on 2.0, which will be even more blight resistant.
Mm-hmm.
And we do that up in Meadowview, Virginia, in the research facility, but also in the state chapters. There's 16 chapters up and down the East Coast, and going out as far as Indiana, Ohio, and they represent 20 states. So they are taking American chestnut trees that are typical of that area and breeding the genetics from those trees into products coming from Meadowview, or we may take pollen up there to Meadowview and pollinate trees in Meadowview. So the states are trying to genetically produce a tree adapted to its area. So here in the Carolinas, we have what we call lowland chestnuts, maybe 12,000 feet or less in elevation. And then we have trees where the parent tree is coming at it from a higher elevation. And we're trying to get as much genetics as we can. We're going to be having 20 different lines of chestnut trees, hybrid chestnut trees in our orchards that we breed, and these will have a lot of different diversity among their characteristics and genes. So our nearest orchard here, I think, is up at Edneyville, North Carolina. That's actually a seed orchard, and we are now, this spring will be the third year we plant maybe as many as 1,000 trees in plots, with the idea that one of those in each plot will be a seed tree that can cross with other trees and then produce very different nuts planted out into the forest. So that's Edneyville, and the seed orchard. We have one up at Cataloochee Ranch, which probably is going to be another seed orchard. That's you're up in Maggie Valley area. Those folks will give you a tour if you're interested in seeing that.
Will these be used for seed or crossing, or depending on how they do? Or
Want to answer that?
Yeah. So in terms of will the restoration chestnuts be used to keep moving the breeding program forward? Yes. Everything that we have that has high levels of blight resistance stays in the program, produces nuts, and moves forward. So with a restoration chestnut tree, once we get our seed orchards to the point that we're down to those few hundred trees out of the tens of thousands that make a seed orchard, once you've honed it down to the few hundred that are the best, those trees open pollinate, producing more of, we call this a restoration chestnut, but in scientific terms we would call this a B3F3 because of certain numbers of back crosses and then inner crosses. Those would go into the forest, and those would open pollinate with one another and become a self-sustaining grove of chestnut trees. Then they would become part of a mixed forest planting, and that's ultimately what we've already started doing. We've been planting some of our B3F3s in forest plantings, and all those plantings are very scientific. We're using those to understand the best ways to introduce the trees. We're learning more about genetics as we go forward. All these trees are intended to open pollinate and create nuts. The ones that we're planting here, these ones will open pollinate too, and there are some things you can do with the nuts. If you wanted to take the nuts and do forest plantings, Ford or somebody from Harmon Field or somebody would talk to us about it, and we would try to coordinate that with you so that it was done in a scientific manner, but it could be done. I mean, the idea is if these trees have full blight resistance, we want them to reproduce. And that goes back to the original question of how do you make a breeding program work? You get trees that are resistant enough that they reach a flowering age. And then you do all this controlled pollination. You put the right genes with the right genes, the right mother with the right father. We are very, very specific about which trees go with which trees when we do this program. There's nothing pell-mell about it. And when we get to the end, we have trees that, or we will have trees that we know can be sustained in a forest setting, and then those trees will open pollinate, and their progeny will open pollinate, and they will become self-sustaining.
How many years does it take for them to flower and pollinate?
Well,
I'll give Tom a break. In our orchards in the Carolinas, which are open, got good sunlight, and we sometimes supplement the soil and maybe even irrigate. In 5 years, we normally have trees that are 15, 20 feet tall and are producing nuts. So it's possible.
15 or 20 years?
No,
these trees are about 6 months.
This is the first year, right, Tom?
Yeah, this is about a 6-month-old.
This is growing 1 year, and then planting it like this, it may take a year to adjust, but that next year they'll start shooting up quickly.
Yeah, that's a first. Sorry, I was just going to say, Doug brings up a good point. When we do a transplant like this, a lot of times we like to say the first year they sleep, the next year they creep, the third year they leap. It's going to have to get adjusted, and then it'll take off.
Well, let's say these trees in 5 years are producing nuts. One thing, we'll be tracking these trees for helping people here at Harmon Field and Tom and seeing how they're doing. But if they do produce nuts, you're going to have to get out here before the squirrels get to them. I've been up in the mountains collecting pure American chestnuts for our breeding program, and if you don't get up there early, they're not on the ground. The grouse, the squirrels, whatever, find them and eat them. So deer love them, bear eat them, turkey love them.
At what point do you think this group could say, hey, I would plant in my yard an American chestnut?
Well, you can do that right now. The nuts being produced are available through you pick up a brochure on about the American Chestnut Foundation. They'll just that for a trace there's one level of membership you get X number of nuts, and I think this passing is like 4 times. It depends on the harvest and how many are available.
Yeah.
But there's $500 levels of giving, $1,000 level of giving. I guess they one thing, there is another pathogen called wood rot, and it is equal to American chestnut, so you have to be careful if at an area where the soil has been cultivated or other species have been planted nearby that have root rot. That's a American plant it, let it grow a year. But there are lands. So we're doing breeding rot resistant trees. Dr. Joe James down in Seneca, South Carolina, is instrumental in getting that tree started, and Meadowview is working on introducing the genes again from Asian chestnuts that give the tree resistance. And we do have, if we know an area may have some root rot pathogen in the soil, then we'll use that we can have some resistance to this rot, because we want to test those trees as well. An example of what can happen, there was a time here going west, stopped at a farm with the late 1800s, planted a handful of American chestnut trees, less than a dozen. And then about 100 years later, there are 2,500 trees in a grove. So that's just an indication of how prolific these trees can be, the bountiful nut crop they can produce, and then with the help of squirrels and jays, just natural happenstance, they start spreading and spreading whole groves of trees. That's why, Tom, that 25% of the massive forest back in the late 1800s was a very opportunistic tree. Another going west story. I got some relation to Daniel Boone, and I tracked them all the way to the Willamette Valley of Oregon. And there are trees out there that are 5, 6, 6.5 feet in diameter because, and they're American chestnuts, they don't have a blight problem out there. So these trees planted 100, 125 years ago are getting up to 100 feet tall or better, and maybe as much as 6 feet in diameter. I have stood under some of them. It's wonderful to be able to do that. And that's just a promise of what can happen, what can come, or what used to be through all this work we're doing, breeding of blight-resistant, root rot-resistant trees.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I make a statement. The significance of getting a viable tree with Pacolet Area Conservancy, PAC has the 2 big pieces of property, but the smaller pieces, say 5 or 10 acres, and you get viable chestnuts there, that's going to be the mass crop for so many animals that, you know, it's just unbelievable. Deer and everything else.
Getting them established in an environment like that's going to be the trick, right? When you've got wildlife eating them, we have to be very deliberate about how we reintroduce them to the forest. It reminds me of a story. We were up doing a research planting in Tennessee last year, and the idea is to see which methods of reintroduction are going to work best to reach that critical mass so that the trees can become self-sustaining. And we're putting tubes on these trees, and we're putting deer cages up. And one of the people that was helping said, "Why are you doing all this? Why don't you just come out here and start throwing the nuts on the ground? If this tree is as tenacious as the reports, you know, indicate, you should just be able to plant these trees and they're going to take over and dominate this forest." I said, you know, in reality, animals love to eat these things. Worms love to get into the nuts. There's a lot of things that are going to kill most of these trees. Only a fraction of a percent of American chestnut trees would actually live to reproductive maturity in the forest. It's when you have 4 billion trees in the forest that those odds are in your favor. You know, you only need 1% of your progeny to make it. You know, so if we're trying to reintroduce American chestnut, which we are, we have to go in and be very specific about how we're going to reintroduce them, how we're going to manage the forest, and how we're going to protect those trees, because we want 100% success. We want all those trees to make it to reproductive maturity, and then once they start open pollinating, they should produce enough nuts on their own to become self-sustaining, even with the wildlife eating them. And then they are a benefit to wildlife, and they're going to start to repopulate the forest.
Trees here be protected, cages around them, and
Yeah.
there's that little sapling there. It looks
Pretty tempting to a lot of critters. Yeah, beaver, you name it. Yeah, we're gonna have to protect it.
We'll put a wire cage around it,
Yep.
about 4 feet high roughly. And once the tree gets above there, the deer might browse on the lower leaves, but the tree will keep going up. But that's a good point in our orchards. Even though we may have a fenced-in orchard, as we do up in Edneyville, when we plant the seeds, our chapter does an aluminum cylinder. It's about 2.5 inches in diameter, 10 inches tall, and we'll plant the seed and then slide that halfway down over the nut, keep the bolls out, and critters that won't crawl in there and eat it. And then we'll remove that later after the tree gets a little bit bigger, but that's initially protecting it. And then if we don't have an enclosed area, we'll put sleeves around them to protect them, and also we'll put wire cages around them to protect them. So, as Tom said, there's a lot of work goes into doing this right and trying to assure that the trees do survive and get up to a size where they can start producing nuts. So that's a segue into me saying, if you want to come out and help, we're glad to have help. So we do plantings in the spring. We do inoculations of trees that are 5 years old, where we actually put the fungus into the tree. We go back and rate that 2 times. We go through the selection process. We go through the process of collecting nuts, shucking them out, winterizing them. So it's a lot of fun. It's a little bit of physical work, but it's very rewarding to know that you're involved in helping bring a species back that without help might not survive.
Yeah. In fact, I'd like to say